Hi, I'm Ashton, and today I want to do another trans book review. I've been reading a lot recently. I am currently reading Queer City, which I have mixed opinions about. Content-wise, it's really good, but the writing style isn't really my thing. But that's not what I'm talking about today. I finished Symptoms of Being Human by Jeff Garvin. I read this in half a day. Started it in the morning, finished it before noon. So this is about 300... a dozen, like 300 plus 10 or something pages. So it's not a very thick book. It is young adult fiction, realistic fiction, both of those things, they can co-inhabit the same book. I wrote down so many notes for this, and I'm so excited to talk about it, because with the past 3 trans book reviews I've done, I think in every single one of those, at least one of you has been like, you should do Symptoms of Being Human, so I'm doing Symptoms of Being Human. I do, as always, have mixed opinions. I'm a very, critical reader, so there are things that I am going to critique. There are also a lot of good things, more so than my previous book review that was very negative. Sorry about that. So, pulling up my document, I have 3 pages of notes for this book. First, I'm going to go through a bit of background on this book and my thoughts about it before I read it, and then I'm going to go into the good things, then things that I am unsure about, which there were a lot of, more so than there have been in other books, and finally to things that I didn't quite like as much, and then we're just gonna wrap it up. But let's start with the background. So, as I said, this is by Jeff Garvin. It was published in 2016, and it is the only novel he has written so far, his first novel. Because it was published in 2016, I am going to be a bit harsh of a judge on the language that they use, because 2016 was not a long time ago. I don't think a lot of the terminology around trans issues has changed in the past 3 or so years. I've known I was trans since 2013 or 14. So yeah, what I'm trying to say is terminology around trans people hasn't changed much in the past 3 years, although it is always evolving and changing, obviously. But I am going to be a bit of a harsher judge on the language in this book than I have been in some of the books that I've read that were published a while ago. Also, before I actually get into anything, obviously I have some disclaimers. Every critique and even every positive thing that I present in this video is just from my own perspective. I'm only one trans person. If you love this book, if you hate this book, that's great. I have mixed feelings about it. Overall, I really liked it, but we're gonna get into that later. Regardless, everything that I outline in this review is based on my own feelings and my own reading of the book. Even if it's not necessarily how the author meant to portray things, this is the way that I read it. This is the way that I interpreted it. I would also like to point out that the main character of this book, Riley, is gender fluid. I am not gender fluid. I am a non-binary trans man and or demi-boy and or trans masculine, so obviously I don't have the exact same gender feeling experiences that Riley does, but there are common veins among many non-binary trans people and of course trans people in general, so I still can look at this book from a trans person's perspective, especially a non-binary trans person's perspective. But I did just want to point out that Riley and I don't have the exact same gender identity. I would also like to give some brief trigger warnings, which the book itself did not provide any of, but we'll get into that later. There is transphobia, perhaps obviously. There are drug references. There are a lot of slurs, which again we'll talk about later. There is alcohol mentions, drug mentions, in-depth suicide, and in-depth sexual assault. I'm not going to say anything explicit, nothing nearly as bad as what was actually in the book. If you're uncomfortable hearing about any of those things, don't watch this review, that's okay, or don't read the book. If you don't want to hear about me talking about those things, you probably don't want to hear about Garvin talking about these things. Again, we will get into that. Anyways, regardless of anything that I say in this video, if you liked the book, if you hated the book, I don't dislike you. Nothing I say is an attack against the author. I actually quite like the author himself, so let's talk about that. First things first, Jeff Garvin is a straight cisgender man who wrote a book about a gender-fluid teen. And we all know how I feel about those things in general. I'm very, very skeptical going into this just because I know, firsthand from talking to cis people, reading books about trans people written by cis people, I know that cis people, as hard as they may try, cannot fully 100% grasp what it is to be trans. And I understand that. I'm not blaming cis people for that. But also, in general, I do much prefer books about trans people written by trans people. like 100% of the time, I would put trans-written translet above cis-written translet. So that is something to note. That said, he may be a cis straight man, but he has been a vocal activist for a really long time. I looked at his website and he has blog posts from like ages ago acknowledging his privilege as a straight cis man and talking about like things as complex as rainbow capitalism that you don't often see cishet people talking about. So I did appreciate that. He also has his pronouns in his bio on Twitter, which is generally seen as a good sign, especially when cis people do that, because it means that he's aware that that is something that can create visibility for trans people and normalize trans people having our pronouns in our bios, so that's good. Also, speaking of Twitter though, every time someone follows him, he like tweets them to thank them, and it's just really uncomfortable. Like if you go on his Twitter and you scroll through, it'll just be like, thanks at this person for the follow, thanks at this person for the follow, like over and over. I don't know if there's a bot that does it, maybe he uses that. I just found it kind of odd, and I don't know why I felt the need to point that out. But when I did research on the author, I was like, that's kind of weird. I don't know how I'm going to feel about his writing style if that's the way that he uses social media, especially because some of the plot points of this book are heavily reliant around Riley's use of social media. But as a person, Garvin seems pretty solid. He does like talk about trans rights. It's not like he just wrote the book and fucked off from the trans community. He is like a vocal cis person, and I would consider him a relatively good ally. He retweets art, like fan art, on his Twitter and reposts it on Instagram, and he always does it with credit, which is cool. He also fronts a rock band called 7K. Haven't listened to any of their music. It is on Spotify. Not a lot of people listen to it on Spotify, at least. I don't know, maybe it's great, maybe I'm missing out, but there was a reference to 7K in this book, which I found hilarious. I'm sure it was like a tiny Easter egg, and I'm impressed with myself that I caught it. But page 146. On page 146, our cast of main characters is in a recording studio, and they go to Suite 7K in the recording studio, and I was just immediately like, dude, that's a reference to your band, isn't it? It's gotta be. Like, there's no way that he wrote that coincidentally, but anyways. Oh, I also want to note before I start that I'm going to do my best to keep this review spoiler-free. I'm going to discuss themes and things that happen in general throughout the plot, but mainly when I critique things or when I compliment things, they're not going to be things that are going to spoil the book for you. I just figured I should note that in case you haven't read it yet. Anyways, yeah, so without looking at the book at all, the author himself seems pretty cool. So far, he's only written this book. If he comes out with another book in the future, especially if it's about trans people, I'd probably consider checking it out. As I'll get into later, his writing style isn't really for me, and the genre itself isn't really for me, but I will read anything that has good trans rep in it. I would also like to note before I start that I will be using they/them pronouns for Riley throughout this review. Although they never stated what pronouns they were comfortable with, or I guess the author didn't, there was never a discussion of pronouns, at least not a good one throughout the whole book, which I'll talk about later a bit more, but I'm using they/them as kind of a default, especially since this character is gender fluid. Okay, now that I've got the background and the author out of the way, I first want to address the good things about the book, the things that I really liked. The first thing that I wanted to note is the way that Riley's fashion is described. I think this is something that I liked. I don't know, I do have mixed feelings about it, so maybe this should be in my middle, like, unsure section, but overall I did enjoy it. It seemed very fitting in a way for this. Riley's a high school junior in this book. And at least from a lot of the juniors that I know, and myself like being like only 1 year older than a high school junior, the way that Riley described not only themselves, but like their fashion sense in particular was very amusing to me. Literally on the back cover, the first thing that they describe Riley as is punk rock, which I did find a little bit funny, honestly, because I don't know a lot of punks or people in the alternative community that would like outwardly describe themselves as, oh, who am I? I'm punk rock. I just think it's cute. Maybe that's a bit condescending of me, but you know, it was a good thing. But Riley's outfits are outlined like multiple times throughout the book, which does make sense in a way because as they're gender fluid, they do like to use their outfits as a way of presentation, because as their gender identity fluctuates, they are more comfortable within different outfits and different presentations. Is that obvious? Maybe. Am I over-explaining this? Maybe. Another good thing was that a lot of the experiences of prejudice that Riley had felt very real. They didn't feel like the typical way that a cis author might write a trans person being confronted. It felt a lot more like, as a trans person that's been through a lot of similar things that Riley has, when people like argued over their gender behind their back or like right next to them, I felt that in my core. Although there are like a few bullying cliches, I did overall feel like the level of harassment that Riley experienced for being super duper gender nonconforming was pretty accurate. I also really like the pacing of the introduction of all of the characters. A lot of the times I have trouble keeping up with characters in like more complex series like Lord of the Rings. I love Lord of the Rings, but oh my god, that is a large cast. Also, before reading this book, I recently finished Shakespeare and the Resistance, which is like a nonfiction novel. And I really enjoyed it, but I mean, I guess they weren't characters because they are historical figures, but like the amount of people in that book was overwhelming. Like the Earl of Sussex, the Duke of Sussex, this dude of Essex, like I can't keep track of all of that. So maybe part of why I enjoyed this book so much was because I just finished that book and I was like, too many characters, and then I got to this book and they were introduced in a very like natural flow of things where I was like, I know who this is, I know who this is, and I know who this is. So the introduction of characters was nice, it was natural. I didn't feel like any characters were being like forced upon me, which can sometimes happen, especially in like early writing. I mean, I know this was edited, but regardless, this is Garvin's first book. So creds to him for like really nailing down the pacing of introducing the characters. I really liked that. Another thing that I really liked that was specifically trans related is when Riley describes their gender, they describe their gender in a way that is really similar to ways that I've seen non-binary and gender fluid people describe their genders on the internet and a few people that I know in real life. Riley describes their gender identity as a feeling in their chest, like a compass. Like some days it points to more masc, some days it points to more femme, and that's not like in a presentation way, that's in like an identity way and a way that their dysphoria impacts them. I've definitely seen people that are gender flex or gender fluid describe their gender as like a changing needle in a way. It's hard to describe because I'm not gender fluid, but the way that Riley described it definitely reminded me of ways that I have seen actual gender fluid people describe their genders. So that's cool. I think probably like the most important thing that I felt was good about the book was that Riley's assigned gender is never given to us. We don't know what Riley was assigned at birth, and I freaking love that. Also, I wanted to point out that in my notes, I abbreviated assigned gender at birth as AGAB. So I like automatically read that as all genders are bastards. Just thought someone would appreciate that. I don't know. Anyways, yes, I've read books with non-binary characters in the past where it is very, very clear what their assigned gender at birth was, and I don't feel like that's always the most respectful way to talk about non-binary or gender fluid, in this case, people. Just so you guys know, Jack is on the phone now, so if you hear weird noises in the background, that's because Jack is here, in spirit.
Weird noises. Weird noises.
You can't just say weird noises.
Weird noises.
So even when describing Riley's gendered aspects, Garvin does it in a way that it doesn't give away what they were assigned at birth. One of the things that gives them a lot of dysphoria is their campaign outfit. Riley's dad is a politician, so they have like a campaign outfit that they have to wear when they go to public events and like presentations and stuff, and they describe that as giving them dysphoria because it is so heavily gendered, as like formal clothes often are, but we don't know if it's a dress or if it's a tux. That doesn't give away what they were assigned at birth, and I really liked that aspect. And the reason I liked that is not only because it does feel like a very respectful, almost like not PC, but like a very good way of having a gender fluid character where your reader like just can't put a gender on them, because even if a reader was to say like, oh, but gender fluid doesn't exist, you have to go with your assigned sex at birth, like we don't know our character's assigned sex at birth. For all we know, assigned gender fluid at birth, fuck it. Another reason that I really liked the aspect of their birth gender not being revealed was that it allows the reader to self-insert, like regardless of the reader's assigned sex at birth. So like as a trans masculine person, I could see myself in Riley because they described chest dysphoria, but they didn't give away whether or not they had a chest. They just talked about having the chest dysphoria. So I related to that in the same way that a trans feminine person would also be able to relate to having chest dysphoria, but Riley's like assigned gender at birth isn't given. So regardless of what type of trans person you are, you would be able to relate to it, which I found, I don't know, it's good. I'll just say it's good. The next thing that I wanted to point out was that Riley is not the only trans character in the book, which I loved and I had never noticed before. Like in a lot of the other fictional novels I've read with trans characters, it is like this one trans character where them being trans is like their almost defining characteristic, which is understandable, but it was really nice to have Riley go to, I'm not going to reveal what it is, but go to groups where there are other trans people, like more than one other trans people, a trans guy, a trans girl, a couple non-binary people. It's really cool to see Riley interacting with them in a way that you couldn't have with the other cis characters. But when you introduce other people that have clearly had different paths in life and different ways of discovering that they were trans, that creates a dynamic that allows a cisgender reader to be able to see multiple different sides of different trans stories without presenting like Riley as this one gender fluid person. There's also another non-binary person. So it's cool to have different identities within the same book that, you know, kind of erases any homogenous idea a cisgender reader might have of trans people. I appreciated that. Another thing that I really liked was the incorporation of music throughout the book. As Riley does identify himself as punk rock, it would be kind of weird if there weren't any musical references, but there were so many, and it was great. It was on like page 2 that Riley mentions wearing a Ramones shirt. They have a turntable in the room, which like I can relate to. They talk about the Police, the Pixies. They talked about Against Me. I was taken aback. I was like, hell yeah, I'm ready for this. So the way that they incorporate music is in a couple different ways. One, with Riley's turntable, before a scene of them in their bedroom, like thinking or getting dressed or whatever, they'll mention, I dropped this record on my turntable, and I'll be like, nice, I know that one. And then the other way that it was incorporated was in the blog post that Riley writes that we are given, like in the novel, there's an aspect where it'll put in a little play button and say like, now playing this song by this band. And one of them was Transgender Dysphoria Blues by Against Me. And I was like, hell yeah. So that was really cool to see like music that I listened to reflected in this little punk rock gender fluid kid's life. I did appreciate that. And I feel like part of that is probably because the author is also a musician. But it is something that I'd like to see incorporated into more fictional works, although I understand why it isn't, because it's not something that would necessarily age super well. So I get that, but I did appreciate it. Removing it from all other context, I liked it. So that's all that matters, really, because this is my review. Moving on. Another thing that I thought was really good related to the trans aspect of the book, I feel like I've said aspect 20 bajillion times. On page 29, which is relatively early into this like 300 whatever page book, Riley describes the way that they feel that they're gender fluid, but they also explicitly state, I know it's not like that for all gender fluid people, which I thought was really good. So I really liked that early on in the book, Riley did explicitly state that everybody with this identity experiences it in a different way, and that's cool, that's fine, that's okay. I am very glad that that was explicitly stated, because I worry that cisgender people reading this, if they didn't have previous experience with trans terminology and trans feelings, they wouldn't get that point. So the fact that it was explicitly stated was super duper good. I really liked the incorporation of social media into the dynamics of the story. It was used as a plot point, but it was also definitely used to develop Riley's character. And it was like a major part of the plot, so I don't know why I'm saying it was a point, but you know. So I've read quite a few books before that do attempt to incorporate social media, and it can be kind of awkward, especially when the posts themselves are like written out in the book, but I felt that it was incorporated really, really well into Symptoms. It seemed natural, it was always introduced really easily, and it flowed really easily from Riley's like dialogue with themselves and like with the outside world into the blog post. I feel like authors a lot of the times have a hard time incorporating social media like fluidly into a story, but Garvin did it really, really well. It flowed really naturally, it worked with the narration style, and I liked it. Like that's a blog I would follow, you know? I also heavily related to like the ways that Riley used social media, and I feel like a lot of other trans people would too. They use it throughout the novel as like a kind of outlet for their gender, which I really relate to. I came out online ages before I came out in real life. It helped me experiment with my name and with my pronouns. And I know that's not something I'm alone in. I know a lot of you guys are going through that too. So if you are, I feel like this would be a really like validating book to read, because like Riley is definitely somebody that could be real. I'm not going to get into it explicitly because it would like reveal a little bit of the plot, but the way that Riley interacted with social media in general reminded me a lot of myself, especially as they grew in popularity online in a kind of unexpected way. I felt like they handled a lot of the attention in a similar way that I have. And they got like similar messages to ones that I've gotten, and their reactions reminded me a lot of myself. So I was very much like attached to Riley as a social media person, you know? So that was a dynamic that I felt like was unique for me, but I also feel like it wouldn't be hard to relate to for somebody that's not super online. There's two characters that I want to mention that I really, really liked and I thought were really well fleshed out, and there's a couple I'll get to later. But Riley's dad, I really liked as, I mean, I didn't like him. Like as a person, if I were to meet him, I would hate him. But as a character, I felt like he was really well fleshed out, which I appreciated an extra amount, because I feel like parent characters are oftentimes just there to be parents. Like they're just there to serve as a plot point or to serve as like a foil for another character. But both of Riley's parents, especially their dad, definitely have like a multifaceted development. Riley's dad is a politician, and that impacts the story. The characterization of Riley's parents in general definitely adds dynamics to the story that I don't see a lot in young adult fiction, purely because I've read so many books where parents are like completely absent. Like, you know, they're there, but the kid has like a weird amount of freedom that I haven't experienced, or the parents are like over present. And I feel like a lot of people just struggle with writing parental figures because, like, I would too. I get it. It's hard. But the way that Garvin did it felt really normal. It felt like they could have actually been parents, and they also had more facets to their personality than just your stand-in mom for the sake of having a mom. Like, the dad had a personality. He had, like, a solid character that I could, like, see him being a person, not just, this is a dad. He says, Riley, go to bed. Like, you know, he wasn't used as purely a plot point. He was, like, genuinely a character that had weight, and I appreciated that. The same things apply to Riley's mom, but, like, less of an emphasis on that, because Riley's dad was just more well fleshed out in my reading of it. But, you know, both of them were good characters as characters. Didn't like either of them as people, but as characters, well characterized, well thought out, and more than just your archetype of being a parent. Okay, I'm almost done with the good section, then we can get on to some criticism. For this note, I literally just wrote Beck, punky nerd, because I love Beck as a character, as a person. I didn't feel like she was extremely well fleshed out. Like, her character's there, but it's not incredibly strong. She is a character I felt like I could relate to, but she's not a character that I felt like I could come across in real life, just because she is very fit into a few different cliches. But I really liked her. I was rooting for her the whole time. Just good person. Like her a lot. Also, another gender thing that I related to a little bit too hard, hit really close to home, was on page 78. Riley talks about how the way that people see them impacts the way that they have to interact with people, because being read as like male one day and female the next can be a very turbulent experience, and that's definitely something that I've had as well. So Riley talks about an interaction that they had where they were like, oh, that's really flattering, but I don't know if they're seeing me as a guy or a girl. And like, I read this the same exact day that this exact thing happened to me, which was like a very odd experience. But walking to my car after school, a girl like turned, looked straight at me in the face and was like, you're really hot. And I was like, thank you. But my immediate thought was like, is she flirting with me as like a gay girl? Does she think I'm a lesbian? Does she think I'm a boy and she's flirting with me as a straight girl? Like, I don't know. I didn't know where the compliment was coming from. I was flattered, but very confused. And like, yeah, it's just a gender feeling that I know I'm not the only person that's experienced. So it was a cool thing to see in the book because I know it's not something that the cisgender heterosexual author has experienced. So it was something that I was like, oh, that does happen to trans people. That happens to me. And I wouldn't think that it's something a cis person would think of. So that was really cool. Another dynamic that I really, really liked, probably like my favorite trans-related thing throughout the book, is pretty well summarized by a quote on page 117, where Riley said, "People don't condemn you for being trans, they condemn you for embracing it." And that, I was like, oh boy. And obviously people like do condemn you for being trans, but even further so when you embrace it. One thing that happens throughout the book that isn't really a spoiler is one character says multiple times, like, I don't understand why you're so visibly, I'm going to use the word queer because, like, that's the way that I describe it for myself. And we'll get into the usage of queer later. And Riley kind of has to go on this, like, self-discovery, self-actualization thing to find a way to describe that being visibly queer is something that they can hide, but that would cause them like so much pain that it just isn't worth it. And I feel so similar to that. It's almost like a trans person wrote this book, you know? It's wild to me how much Garvin is able to portray these experiences that I feel are very like niche to being trans. I don't know how much involvement there was of trans people with this book. I don't know if they edited it. I don't know if he had a sensitivity reader. Like, that information isn't as readily available as some of the other stuff that I've talked about. So I don't know how involved trans people were, and I wish I did, but my guess is that there were some of them because, like, damn. Those are all the super positive things I had to say. Now I'm gonna get on to the unsure things that I liked at first, but then wasn't sure about, or things that I hated at first, but like then also wasn't sure about, things that I just wasn't sure about in general. So let's get into that. I actually have a lot of these, so. The first thing that I have on my unsure list is something that just made this like slightly less believable to me. I doubt a blog would rise to popularity as quickly as Riley's did in this story. It just felt to me very much like a convenience plot where, like, oh, this happened. How convenient for the plot is that, huh? Like, it definitely doesn't seem like something that would have happened in real life. Of course, there are blogs and, like, online people that rise to popularity super duper fast, but it's just very unlikely, especially on a platform like Blogler, which we will get into. But Riley becomes, like, very popular on this blogging website called Blogler, which is definitely not Tumblr at all. But I feel like the internet, even back in 2016 when this was published, is very saturated with blogs about gender and gender identity and gender experiences, and I just don't think that a relatively well-written, text-based blog would rise to fame as quickly as Riley's did. Then again, suspension of disbelief is a beautiful thing, and I'm absolutely willing to let that go, which is why this is in my unsure section. Like, was it a little bit unbelievable for me? Yeah, but also, like, I'll give it that convenience, you know, I'll let that slide. Next thing is that a lot of the characters straight up gave me whiplash. Like, their intentions shifted so quickly, and thinking about it now, that might just be because I read this in like half a day, so that could be my fault. Maybe it was a pacing issue of the book as a whole, maybe it was just me reading real fast. Either way, a lot of the characters, specifically Solo and even Riley themselves, kind of changed motivations or like character traits really, really fast. One small example of this is Riley's reaction to being called honey. I know they're gender fluid, but they express early on in the book that, like, regardless, they just don't want to be called honey. Don't call them honey. They ask their mom multiple times, stop calling me that. I don't like it. It makes me uncomfortable. And then around like 50 pages in, that's just completely dropped. Like, multiple times they make it very, very clear that they don't like being called honey. And then their mom just continues to call them honey, and like they don't talk about it ever again. It was just like it seemed like it was going to be significant in some way, and then they just never mention it again, which is weird. Another character that made no sense to me was Derek Yu. This isn't a spoiler because he was mentioned like really early on and then again, never mentioned again. He was given like a whole paragraph of characterization. He was like offhand mentioned once later in the book. He just wasn't necessary. You could cut out everything that had to do with Derek Yu, and you wouldn't notice. It'd still be the same book, which I think is a little bit of a writing flaw. But again, this is his first book. I'll give him a pass for it. But like, I just don't understand, where did this character come from? Why did he not exist after like the third chapter? I don't know. Ooh, next, the apostrophe thing. This is a thing that bothers me. Early on, the first bit of hate mail that Riley gets on their blog is "you're a fag" with the wrong "you're." You know, classic. I've probably gotten dozens of those comments. But the response is a very snarky post about the difference between "your" and "your" with and without the apostrophe, which I get it. But I feel like there's a very, very fine line as to when critiquing grammar like that is okay. It has really classist and ableist undertones that, like, I could do a patches and parley on that. Maybe I will. I'll write that down. It's just something that I try to avoid. I used to do it a lot more than I do now, and I, like, actively attempt to avoid doing that when it's something that I know could be interpreted in the wrong way. There's just a very fine line there, and I know that Garvin probably didn't take that into consideration, but reading it, it stood out to me, and I was like, you know, English might be their second language, like that might come off as like kind of bad, it might come off as, like, I know it happens online all the time, it's just a little pet peeve of mine when people like correct grammar in little ways that aren't relevant. If someone's insulting your intelligence and they use the wrong "your," fucking go for it. Go at them. But like, if they're being homophobic, I would say focus on what they're saying that's wrong instead of just going for their grammar. It seems like a cop-out. It felt uncomfortable to me. Maybe I'll cut this from the video because I'm not sure if anybody else is going to feel the same way, but that was just my take on it. Okay, next thing. This was probably the most weird, unsure thing for me. The website that Riley uses for their social media is called Blogler. It has all of the exact same functions as Tumblr. You reblog, you like, you know, you have followers, not like fans or whatever. You get asks and they can be anonymous. Like, this is Tumblr. Is he not allowed to say Tumblr? Like, is that a copyright issue? I don't know. But he calls it Blogler, which is like, fine, I get it. Invent your new social media for your book.
A lot of times it is a copyright issue.
Oh, you think so?
Yeah, like in movies, a lot of times. That's why a lot of times in movies, if there's social media, you'll rarely see actual social media sites because it does cost more, and social media companies get uppity about, you know, their intellectual property, as they put it.
Okay, thank you for your input.
No problem. That's what I'm here for.
Regardless of Jack's copyright input, it just seemed very blatant to me. Like, if you're going to use a blogging website, I get it if it's based off of Tumblr, but it was so identical to Tumblr. Like, they mentioned the blue background, I think, and like all of the dynamics were the exact same. You could have tweaked it a little bit to make it seem like an actual site of its own, because even reading it, like when it first popped up, it was like, this is Tumblr. This is just Tumblr. They used hashtags in the same way. Like, literally everything was the exact same as Tumblr. And again, if it's a copyright thing, I get it. But like, they could have changed something small to make it a bit less like very blatantly Tumblr. So, I don't know. It bothered me. And I get it. It's not going to bother everyone, but it bothered me. You know, you can invent whatever name for your new social media site that you want. You go with Blogler. Another thing that felt very odd to me was the whole vegan dynamic. Vegans, you're great. I love you. I'm a vegetarian. But like, Riley's veganism was just like kind of sprinkled in throughout without any apparent reason. And I'm not saying you can't be vegan without a reason, but like, it was almost absent for the whole story until it was convenient. Like, it just seemed thrown in last minute almost. And if it was written in more consistently, I would have loved it. But it just seems thrown in at really convenient points where you're like, oh yeah, I forgot about that. There's that aspect of Riley's character that's never mentioned outside of when it's super convenient for the plot. So that bothered me a little bit. But once again, I'm willing to let that go. Ooh, next thing that annoyed me a little bit. Keep in mind, again, that this book was published in 2016. Not a lot of language surrounding trans issues have changed since then. On page 114, Garvin explains through Riley what the word cisgender means. and they say cis male and cis female as like one word without a space between them. That's not how you use that. That'd be like if I said trans male or trans female, like in one word, you know? That's just not how that word is used. So teaching that lesson in a way that is incorrect kind of struck me as odd. And I'm not sure if that's something that Garvin was miseducated about, or if it's something that the editors and or sensitivity readers just missed. But I found that odd, especially since the rest of the book was very, very good with terminology.
Ashton standing up for the rights of cis Americans.
Ooh, another thing that I really would have loved if it had been more significant was on page 124, Garvin mentions deeply conflicted Catholics as a way of talking about how the LGBT community and religion can often interact in very complex ways. I would have appreciated if that was explored a little bit more. Like it was just kind of thrown in as an offhand comment, but in a way that felt like it was gonna come up again later, and then it just didn't. Which again was just a weird thing. Just kind of like Derek Yu, like there it was, there did it go, where did it go? Cotton Eye Joe.
Wow.
I'm sorry. This, I wasn't sure whether to put it in the unsure or the straight up bad section. Riley never uses neutral pronouns for anybody. There's a genderqueer character that is self-described as genderqueer, and Riley consistently switches between he and she, doing the whole like he or she, or like he or she thing, which was very odd, especially for somebody that appears to be relatively well-versed in trans, like, terminology, that there was no mention of neutral pronouns, like, throughout the whole book. There was just no discussion of gender-neutral pronouns. I'm using they for Riley because it's never given what pronouns we should use for Riley. It was just so weird to me that you have more than one non-binary character and you never use the singular they or even like a neopronoun, like it's just he or she, question mark in italics. Like, I just didn't understand why you'd go out of your way to write a book on a non-binary person and not even once address singular they pronouns or like singular gender neutral pronouns. That was weird to me. That I am placing on the author. It is something, of course, that a sensitivity reader would have caught. Hire me as your sensitivity reader. I'll fix this before, and I'll make a video review of your book and I will give it good reviews because I read it before. Anyways, yeah, hire me, use gender neutral pronouns. It's not that hard, and it would have added a lot to the book. It would have been so easy to work in that conversation too. It's not like it would have been inconvenient for the plot. It's not like it would have been super out of context. Like, it would have made a lot of sense. You could have fit it in a multitude of places, and I don't understand why you didn't. Another thing that I found odd is the hive mind that Riley described of the quote-unquote hardcore kids, is what Riley called them. Beck, after kind of separating herself from the quote-unquote hardcore kid group, she complains about, oh, people are okay one-on-one, but get them in groups, they start adopting this hive mind. Like, we all have to like the same band and buy the same brand of hair dye. As many alternative people that I know, I have never once been pressured to use the same hair dye as everyone else, or even like the same bands. Like, yeah, I talk about bands with friends that like the same types of music as me, but it's never like, we all have to like this band and only use Manic Panic. Like, that's weird. That type of hive mind, I've never witnessed that develop in any sort of alternative community, so I found that really unrealistic. Maybe it happens, but if it does, it is, as they say, not very punk rock. Maybe other people do have that dynamic in their friend groups, but at least in the subcultures that I've been involved in, that's not really a thing. Next is a general point, but just general plot convenience. Everything that happened was just so convenient, which I get is like sometimes necessary, but it was a little bit blatant sometimes. I'm not going to go into detail on that. It was just something that I was kind of like, I don't believe that all of this happened. Like, this all seems very well planned out, and I'm assuming it was well planned out because, you know, it's a novel, it's a good novel, but it is like transparently planned out, if that makes sense. I said I wasn't gonna go into detail on that, and then I ranted about it for 30 seconds. Why am I like this? Two more things in the unsure section. One, AP English is not in itself a class. I don't know why Riley took AP English that doesn't exist. Yes, we called it AP English, but like there are two AP Englishes, so saying Riley's taking AP English like doesn't help me figure out what they're taking. So it did make it seem unrealistic to me. Again, suspension of disbelief. Not everybody's gonna have an intimate knowledge of AP classes, but I do, and I'm calling you out on it. The fact that the inclusion of AP English as a class is what made this book unbelievable for me is probably a good sign. All right, last thing in the unsure section, a phrase, or rather like a whole sentence that just felt really weird. The outfit is part punk rock, part Catholic schoolgirl, part prep school lacrosse guy. I love it. I absolutely adore it. I want to marry it and make babies with it. Listen, I like a good outfit as much as everybody else. I love like putting together a cute outfit. It's fun. I enjoy it. But I don't think I've ever written multiple sentences on loving my look so much that I want to literally fuck it and have children with it. I mean, I guess if anyone makes a joke about fucking their outfit, it would be a junior in high school. Like, I make dick jokes, I get it, but it just seemed like a joke that Garvin wrote and then like forgot to take out. You know, it felt like it would have been funny if it was like an inside joke or something, but it's very unprecedented. It doesn't seem like it's in Riley's character whatsoever. So that felt really weird. It felt like a bad joke that Garvin just forgot to delete. Finally, on to the bad. Things that I really just didn't appreciate about this novel. This video is probably almost over now. You will be released from class soon. I'm sorry, this has been a long lecture. First thing on my bad list was the amount of clickiness in the high school also kind of made it unrealistic. And I didn't put this on the unsure list just because it's something that is a trope that I see so commonly. Like the fact that the school was so cliquish that Riley even gave the groups themselves like the names like the hardcores. Like that doesn't happen. You go out into the quad, all the seniors are eating lunch. Like, yeah, we have our tables, but it's not like clear distinction. Like I'll sit with a football player and a trans kid at the same time. You know, it's not, there's not a group of metalheads over here and a group of jocks over here. High school just isn't that separated, you know? Like, I guess it can be, and it is in some senses. It's just not distinct enough for it to happen like on the first day of school and for a new student to like be able to point out those cliques one by one. That was a bit weird for me. Given Garvin is older, from the pictures that I've seen of him, I don't think he's been to high school in like minimum 10 years. So I don't know how different it was then, but like, again, this book came out in 2016. I was in high school in 2016, and cliques are just not as much of a thing as a lot of fiction writers make them out to be. Another thing that wasn't the author's fault, but something that did throw me off was the spacing of the lines. They use, what's the word? Oh, they use like justified thing, which if you don't know is when, like in a newspaper article, when the lines on each side of the paper are like completely straight, which is fine. A lot of books use that, and I don't usually have an issue with it. But it created really, really squishy spacing to the point where I was questioning, is this just because it's justified? Is this meant to be an attempt at showing diction in a character's line? It happened multiple times. Page 13, page 203, page 207, and page 265 were just a few that I noticed were like really squished together and really weird. And like I had to read the line multiple times because you literally couldn't tell where the words were separated. So I know that's probably a publishing issue, and it might be different in different editions of this book, but for the one that I read, it kind of threw me off a bit. And I know I'm picky. I told you I'm a critical reader, I'm sorry. A trope that I really, really hate, I don't know if it would be considered a trope or just like a thing that authors do, handwriting fonts. I do not like handwriting fonts. Any font that attempts to look like handwriting doesn't end up looking like handwriting because you cannot replicate handwriting with characters that are the same every time they're repeated. It doesn't work. It looks cheesy. I would much rather someone's quote-unquote handwriting be written in, like, italics or some other way of designating that it is their handwriting. Like, use different fonts all you want in your books. I don't care. But please don't use handwriting fonts. I hate them, can't stand them, big pet peeve. And this book used them only once. I would have been less peeved about it if it had been a consistent thing, but there's like one line of a handwritten font being used, and then it's never used again. So I don't know why they used it in the first place.
So I take it you're not a Comic Sans fan.
I mean, I don't hate Comic Sans as much as a lot of people do, but like it's not a favorite. Next thing that made me cringe was on page 74, which for the record is only 5 pages after the use of the handwriting font. On page 74, Riley describes Beck's room as bipolar. This was published in 2016. Like, come on. Just please stop using mental illnesses as, like, adjectives. That's not how they're used. I don't know if I have to explain why that's bad, but, like, just don't do that. Come on, I was 15 in 2016 and I already knew that. Like, you know, Another thing that made this seem relatively unrealistic for me was that Riley is consistently, and I mean like consistently 100% of the time, nobody reads them as male or female. Which, like, I get that that's convenient to the plot, again, but as somebody that presents relatively androgynously, most of the time, I'm still read one way or the other, even without, like, someone hearing how deep my voice is. I don't know anybody that is consistently gendered as completely neutral. I wish that could happen, you know, I wish that cis people were, like, able to pick up on cues like that, but the majority of the time they aren't, and the fact that everybody that Riley encounters doesn't pick up at all any sort of gender just doesn't seem realistic. I feel like it's super duper difficult to go through life without being gendered one way or the other, and throughout the book there was not a single time I noticed, at least, that Riley was referred to by literally any pronoun at all. Like, there are no pronouns that refer to Riley. I just don't get the whole pronoun thing. They didn't mention neutral pronouns at all. Riley isn't referred to with any pronouns. Like, what are we supposed to do? I don't know. All right, almost done. Next thing, and probably the most important thing I would say of why I would be careful around this book is sexual assault is detailed. It is detailed. I was not expecting it. Like, I went into that scene and the thing happened, and I'm not going to spoil it, but like a thing happened and it was described, it was detailed multiple times, like, you know, everything that happened, and I was sitting in class texting Jack like, oh my god, I have whiplash, I don't, like, this is bad, I didn't want to read this, I would have appreciated a warning. Take this as your trigger warning because the book doesn't give you one. They don't give you a content warning, which, again, I'll discuss in a few seconds. But yeah, there was, explicitly described sexual assault that I don't believe belongs in a young adult fiction novel. Is that a controversial take? I don't know. Like, if I'm a young trans kid reading this, literally the last thing I want to read is about a young trans kid like me being sexually assaulted. I did not like that whatsoever. Bad decision. I don't think it was necessary. The plot could have been achieved in a much less awfully triggering way, you know? Anyways, aside from that, there's also intense description of suicide multiple times without any sort of content warning, so that's also great. Not something that I appreciated at all. Definitely unnecessary. It could have even been like heavily implied that that's what happened, but I don't think the explicit discussion of like methods of suicide was necessary, especially again in a young adult fiction novel. It could have been heavily implied, it could have been even talked about, but not to the explicit extent that it was. Bouncing off of those two things, I think that any sort of content warning, even if it was like in a like 1-page prologue thing before the first chapter, just say, thanks for picking up this book. Just so you know, these things are discussed. Cool. If you don't want to read it, that's fine. Again, this was published in 2016, and I still don't understand why you can't dedicate a single page to just warning the reader that, hey, there's like sensitive topics in here, just be aware of that, because reading it, I was just absolutely not prepared for the assault that Riley went through. I'm not going to discuss it in detail, just know that it did happen, and it was a lot to read, like sitting in environmental science class, trying to not cry, thank you very much. Anyways, last thing, aside from trigger warnings, there were so many slurs. Pretty early on in the book, after the first slur had been used a couple times, I was like, I have a feeling this isn't going to be the end of this, so I kept a tally. And my tally is there are 7 occurrences of the T slur, which if you don't know is T-R-A-N-N-Y, not something that I reclaim for myself. 22 occurrences of the F slur in either fag or faggot, that is the most common slur. There were 12 occurrences of the D slur, which is another word for a damn, but used in a derogatory way towards lesbians, and 4 accounts of the Q slur, which is queer, which I use for myself, but like in a derogatory way. It was used in the book 4 times. For a cisgender, heterosexual man to write down the word faggot 22 times is just a very uncomfortable thought for me. And again, this is something that could have been addressed, like, on the same page as that content warning, maybe. Say, like, hey, there are multiple slurs used throughout this book that the author does not necessarily have the identities necessary to reclaim. That's bad wording, but I'm sure that they could figure out better wording. Never once was any of these words referred to as a slur. They were just used in extremely derogatory ways, not discussed, not identified as slurs, just used casually by the white cishet guy that's writing this book. That made me very uncomfortable. And I frankly don't appreciate it. That said, I understand that those slurs are used in real life, and I understand that people like Riley are called those slurs because I've been called all those things more than 22 times. The amount that it was used was excessive. It was repeated like multiple times per page. It was just uncomfortable, and it just could have been handled so much better. If there was even like a discussion between Beck and Riley that was like, I was called a faggot, and Riley's like, oh, that's a slur. Obviously not exactly like that. That wouldn't fit in the book anywhere. But there could so easily be a conversation about slurs that just wasn't there. That's a weird place to end this, but that is all I have to say about this book. To close it off, my overall thoughts, it is good. It is a very, very good representation of a gender fluid person. I liked a lot of the things that they gave as kind of qualifiers. I liked a lot of the characters. I could see a lot of the things happening. It didn't seem terribly unrealistic, even though it is a fiction novel. The way that social media is used is, for the most part, very good and very well integrated. Riley as a character is very distinctive and unique. I enjoyed the vast majority of the book. It was just a few, I guess, vast character changes that made it seem unrealistic, as well as just the lack of a few discussions that are really, really important to have when you're talking about trans-related stuff, notably the pronouns and, you know, the onslaught of slurs that I experienced. I would recommend it, but not to a young reader. I would recommend it to somebody that is already relatively well educated on trans issues and on LGBT issues in general, because I feel like otherwise you might read it and not understand that those words are slurs or that there are pronouns other than he and she. Yeah, so there were a few flaws. Overall, I really liked it. I'm glad I read it, and I'm glad so many of you recommended it to me. So yeah, this was definitely one of my more positive trans book reviews. I know I harped on a lot of things near the end there, but there were a lot of flaws, as there always will be when it's a cis-het dude writing about trans folks. What can you say? But for a cis-het dude writing about trans folks, fucking bravo. Genuinely, kudos to this guy, because he gets it a lot more than some other cisgender authors that I've read have. So yeah, that is all. I'm sorry if this was a bit of an abrupt ending, but my throat feels like sandpaper and I need water. And I've been talking for over an hour, so I'm gonna go now. If you've read this book, let me know what you think, if you agree with me, if you disagree with me. I would love to talk about it because Jack hasn't read it, so I can't talk about it with him. Jack left his phone on the ground and is no longer with us. So bye from me and bye from Jack, and I'll talk to you later, maybe.